Saturdays 2020, which celebrated the 150th anniversary of women first voting in Utah, the first women to vote in the modern nation, and the centennial of the 19th Amendment through education, events, and the arts. Her book, Pioneering the Vote, The Untold Story of Suffragists in Utah and the West, came out in August 2020 as part of the Better Days 2020 celebration of the Utah and National Suffrage Anniversaries. Her marketing experience includes in-house positions at Silicon Valley companies, as well as advertising agencies, including a role in the I'm a Mormon campaign. She is currently the owner of a small software company called Duet Partner that serves independent music teachers. Neylan has been an important voice in Latter-day Saint and Utah women's advocacy for over a decade, first as the founder of the Mormon Women Project, a nonprofit dedicated to mobilizing Latter-day Saint women by telling their stories and exploring opportunities for increasing their voice within the church institution. Her book, Women at Church, Magnifying LDS Women's Local Impact, has been called, quote, a monumental piece of work, pivotal, and a remarkable resource that belongs in every Latter-day Saint home, end quote. Neylan is a graduate of Yale University, mother to 3 daughters, and lives in Salt Lake City. Please welcome Neylan McBaine to the stage.
One here. Oh, there it is. Okay. Is it this one or is it? It's this one. Great. Okay. Well, I am really honored that you came out today to participate in this convocation and hear what I hope is a really interesting story. Because in my mind, good history is good storytelling. And good stories are what help us create identities for ourselves, find our place in the world, determine who we are, what we want to be, and how we want to move forward. And I hope that the story that I tell you today will be really impactful for you in helping you shape your identity as young people in Utah. Whether you're from here originally or whether you're going to stay here, this story is going to matter to you because you're here right now at a really critical and pivotal time in your lives. And you will always carry that identity with you as somebody who lived in Utah and was a Utahn for at least a brief period of time. This story also has really important implications for our entire nation. The idea of who gets to vote is a critical piece of conversation that we are still debating today. We're entering an election cycle here right now. Well, we're entering the height of an election cycle right here, as you might have noticed, with all of the campaign signs. Campaigns are ramping up. Various states are having their last final drop-dead deadlines to register to vote right around this period. And these conversations of who gets to vote, who gets to participate in our democratic system, those questions are alive and well. And I'm going to take us back to some of the very earliest conversations about that question that existed in our country over 150 years ago. And I hope by the end of this, I'm going to draw a through line to help you understand why these questions are still alive today and why Utah's role in that conversation was so important, not just for women, but for all of us as Americans today, and all of us who are wondering about the role of our civic participation. So I'm going to, I have to come over here to click my computer, but I'm going to take you through a brief history. We have to deal with some named dates and places in this story. But hopefully those will be really interesting to you, and so then we can get to some really reflective, more analytical parts at the end. And I'd love for you to think of some questions as well that we can tackle together at the end. As was mentioned in my bio, in 2016, I was coming out of a career in marketing and advertising, and I'd also done a lot of volunteer women's advocacy work. I was living here in Utah. I was raising three young daughters in 2016, and I realized through some reading that I was doing that Utah had a very unique event happen in February of 1870. The first American woman voted under an equal suffrage law in the United States. Now, this event, the way we describe this event, it's important to get it right, and I'll talk more about that later. Exactly the words we use to describe it, what I'm not saying, what I am saying in describing this event. But when I realized that, I just had an aha moment, and I just thought, why is this story not told? This is an incredible opportunity for Utahns to embrace a really positive aspect of our history that has been completely lost. And so in 2016, a couple of friends and I put together a nonprofit called Better Days 2020. And the goal was to educate Utahns about these critical points of women's history, of civic history, in preparation for the year 2020. And what was important about that year was that it represented the 150th anniversary of that first female vote here in Utah, so from 1870 to 2020. It also represented the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment. And the 19th Amendment was the amendment that was added to the US Constitution that expanded women's voting rights beyond what they had been previously. And we'll talk again about the language associated with that and why it's really important to describe that in a particular way. And we thought, those are two really big events that are going to be celebrated by the whole, the 19th Amendment will be celebrated by the whole country in 2020, and what a great opportunity to piggyback off of that and tell the story of Utah as well. Of course, when we got into the story, we recognized that both of these events, the first woman voting in Utah and the passage of the 19th Amendment, were only just still the beginning of the story. And as I mentioned, this question of who gets to vote and who gets to participate in our civic life, continued through the 20th century with lots of additional legislation that opened doors to more marginalized groups being able to participate civically. And the most important piece of legislation that we wanted to highlight, with also the numbers lined up with the 55th anniversary, was the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So we'll be talking about all three of those pieces of those important events as sort of the backbone of this story that I'm going to tell you today. In 2020, by 2020, I'll just roughly tell you that Better Days 2020 we had created new curriculum modules for 4th, 5th, 7th, and 11th grades. We had edited the Utah history textbook. We had trained over 1,000 teachers throughout the state to teach new women's history curricula. We had written 3 books, of which mine was one. We had commissioned 50 illustrations of leading Utah women, which I'll share with you in this presentation. We had a touring exhibit that went to about 24 different universities. In fact, it was here at Snow College in 2019, I think. We unveiled a monument in downtown Salt Lake City on the grounds of where the first woman voted. And we built a statue of an important woman from this story that is actually going to be going to the US Capitol building. So over the course of those 4 or 5 years, we did all of that. It was really exciting. And then 2020 hit, and the pandemic hit, and the great summer of celebration was halted. So unfortunately, we kind of petered out at the end of 2020. But the legacy of all of that work is still alive and well, and so I encourage you to look up more of the story when I'm done here. Our goal with Better Days 2020 was to have every Utahn know these 3 facts by the end of the year, or because of the pandemic, we're giving ourselves license, maybe the end of the decade, if we're effective. We wanted Utahns to know that Utah women were the first to vote in the modern nation. And again, I'll talk about why we say it that way. We wanted people to know the name of Emmeline B. Wells. She was the most famous woman in Utah in her day, and the most famous Utah woman in the nation in her day. And there's so much we can share about Emmeline Wells, and she's my personal hero. But one of the fun things that kind of shows her cachet and her importance was the fact that she met 4 US presidents in her advocacy work for women. So she was long-serving, very impactful. And then lastly, we want people to know that Utah elected the first female state senator in the nation in 1896, and that'll be part of the story I'm telling you today as well. Her name was Martha Hughes Cannon, and we want people to know that name as well. So if you don't remember anything else from today, just remember these 3 facts, and I promise you that will have an impact on the way that you think of yourself as a Utahn today. Okay, so we're going to start our story. I like to start my story with this picture, which is on the cover of my book, because I think it shows the juxtaposition, how far the pendulum has swung from the way Utah and the West were perceived during the early days of the suffrage movement, of the movement to give women the right to vote, to where we are today. This was a political cartoon that appeared on the cover of a magazine in about 1914. The suffrage movement was already about 75 years old. It was a lengthy, multi-generational effort where women had started in New England at a small tea table, writing out a list of demands of what they wanted for their civic participation. And it had grown to be 3 million women strong over the course of 75 years, in which women predominantly requested the right to vote, the right to participate in civic elections. And at the beginning of the 20th century, this was the way the nation was perceived in regards to the progress of women's advocacy in the nation. The West was leading the way. The West was emancipated. The women of the West were free. The states that are represented here had already built into their constitutions the right for women to vote. And you can see here, and I'm from New York City, and when I was born and raised, nothing good happened west of the Mississippi. Like, that was just not part of our history curriculum. You know, everything was about the original 13 colonies, all good things happened in New England. And that was not the way that the country perceived the progress of women's advocacy up until that point. That's really important to recognize, because today, unfortunately, that perspective has really shifted when we look at a state like Utah that, according to many metrics that academic institutions and business institutions look at, we are ranked very low, if not lowest, when it comes to women's civic participation, women's participation in business communities, women's participation on boards, the wage gap between men and women. In many of those factors, we are the lowest of the nation. And so just putting ourselves in that mindset of, wow, like, this isn't just a Utah story. The leadership of Utah led to the entire Western United States in being this pillar of light and liberty for the country. Okay, so I mentioned that February 14th, 1870 is where we're going to kind of start our story today. And it starts with a woman named Sarah Young. She was a 23-year-old school teacher. And on February 14th, 1870, she walked to this building, which still stands in downtown Salt Lake City, the Council Hall building, and she cast a ballot in a city election. Sarah Young was the first woman in the United States to legally cast a ballot under an equal suffrage law. So how did this happen? Sarah was the product of political tensions between the territory of Utah and the federal government in Washington, D.C. So you may know, if you spend any time in Utah, that the pioneers entered the Salt Lake Valley in 1847. It was a territory at that time. It was not part of the United States officially. In fact, the Mormon pioneers thought they were escaping the United States because they'd received so much persecution in the United States. But when they got here, they figured that because Utah was a territory, they were actually going to be safer and have more benefits if there was a state rather than a territory. So even though they didn't like the United States and they had just escaped it, they turned around and asked the federal government to become a state. And the federal government said, no way. There was one major reason why the federal government didn't want the people in Utah to become official American citizens and gain statehood. We're going to talk about this reason a lot today, and that reason is the practice of plural marriage, the practice of polygamy that the Latter-day Saints were engaging in at this time, which is where one man has more than one wife. And so the federal government said, no way, until you get rid of that, you can't become a state. And one of the things that the federal government did was to say, you know what? If we enfranchise, if we give women the right to vote, the Utah women, they're going to vote out leaders who support plural marriage because, of course, plural marriage is abominable and oppressive and abusive to women. So if they get their political rights, those women out in Utah are going to get rid of this scourge of polygamy, and we'll be able to more comfortably bring Utah into the nation as a state. And so, meanwhile, back here in Utah, the territorial legislature, the people that were running the territory of Utah, who were almost all LDS men, said, okay, we'll see what happens when we give our women the right to vote. We'll see if they do what you think they're going to do. And so they called Congress's bluff, and they said, okay, we're going to enfranchise our women. We're going to give them the right to vote. And they did. And 2 days later, Sarah Young joined 28 other Salt Lake women in participating in the first election legally open to women in the United States. So again, we have to say this very carefully because first of all, some women in the colony of New Jersey back in 1811 had voted because they were property owners and colonial laws allowed that for a brief amount of time. We also have to be cognizant of the fact that some women were voting in school board elections. That was thought to be proper, that women could participate in states like Kansas in, the educational experience of children. But at this time, there was no general law that said women can vote in elections. And so that's what made this particular election very, very unique, and it became a first. Again, I want to clarify that, this was limited to white women. The women who voted in this municipal election that day were called the leading ladies of Salt Lake City. They were, related to important men. This was not just, okay, we've opened the doors to anybody off the street who wants to vote. This was still a very controlled process, so we have to be careful when we describe that. I talked a little bit about the role of plural marriage in these political debates that were going on between Washington, D.C. and the territory of Utah. These are the equivalent of the memes of the day. These are political cartoons that stereotype. They sort of bundle impressions together and put them into the world and make them viral. And you can see that, without looking too closely, you can even tell that these are very derogatory cartoons. The practice of plural marriage by the Latter-day Saints was considered the twin barbarism of this country, along with slavery. It was one of the major political discussions of the 19th century America. It's almost impossible to overstate how big a deal the discussion of plural marriage was in national politics in America in the 19th century. For the Mormons' part, they were a radical people who were embracing a unique social experiment. In their minds, there was an element of it that was dictated by God. There was an element of it that was trying to solve the problem of unmarried women, spinster women, in the cities that they had come from, in the European cities that many of them had come from, in the New England cities many of them had come from. They saw women, limited job opportunities, who became financially destitute or were left by widowed. And in their minds, it was a way of creating some sort of familial unit that sort of safely brought everybody in, both in an economic and also social construct. And so, the women did not vote out their polygamous leaders when they were given the right to vote. In fact, they supported their polygamous leaders in a very strange twist, surprising twist. In fact, they started gathering, and they had some of the largest public demonstrations in the history of Utah in support of plural marriage, right around the same time that Sarah Young cast her first vote. In 1870, there was something called the Indignation Meeting that was held in the Tabernacle, where 6,000 women, only women, they locked the doors to all men except male reporters, gathered together to demonstrate in favor of their right to practice their religion as they saw fit, to advocate for religious liberty, essentially, at that time. And there were multiple speakers that were pulled from those women, those leading ladies of Utah, as I mentioned. And at that time, those 6,000 women in the Tabernacle represented 15% of the entire territorial population. So per capita, this was the largest demonstration that's ever happened in Utah. And this completely confused the federal government. This completely confused the East Coast. And they didn't know what to do about it. And so for years, the East Coast, the federal government and Congress were battling with the territorial government over whether, how were we going to get rid of this strange practice that these people out in Utah were engaging in. And finally, in 1887, the federal government said, okay, we know what to do. We're going to disenfranchise the Utah women. We're going to take away that right to vote that they were given 17 years earlier. This was a huge deal. I mean, think about it. Some of you might be pretty close to 17 years old right now. Think of if you had grown up your entire life knowing that you were the only place in the United States that got to exercise this really incredible right as a woman. And then all of a sudden, at age 17, it's stripped from you. I mean, this was generations of Utahns who had grown up being really proud of their leadership. And during those 17 years that they were leading, they had attracted the attention of the national suffrage leaders. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton were coming to Utah and saying, wow, we don't know what's going on with that polygamy thing, but the women there are doing something that no other American women are doing, and we want to know how it's working. And so they were getting massive amounts of attention for this. And so in 1887, when the federal government stripped Utah women of their right to vote, there was a massive protest, massive uproar, and this era of Utah's suffrage movement was led by a woman named Emmeline Wells. So this is Emmeline Wells, and hopefully you remember that I mentioned her name early on too. For about 50 years, Emmeline Wells was the leading women's advocate here in Utah. And she got her start in 1887 when she was stripped of her right to vote, and she was also a plural wife. She was the 6th plural wife of the mayor of Salt Lake City, Daniel Wells. Interestingly, she had been widowed twice before, and as the mother of 5 daughters, she had proposed to Daniel Wells and asked him to take her under his wing and help raise her children. So she was fully committed to being a plural wife. And she didn't see, as most of the women didn't at that time, she didn't see a conflict between being engaged in polygamy and being in favor of women's suffrage. For most of the women here at that time, those were parallel principles. They supported each other. And so Emmeline started writing, and she edited the longest-running suffrage newspaper in the country. It was called The Woman's Exponent. She edited it for 36 years, and she wrote thousands of editorials in support of Utah women gaining their right to vote back and also extending the right to vote to all American women, all American white women, actually. And so she became the leading voice of the the movement and also the national suffrage movement. I mentioned that the practice of plural marriage went hand in hand with the women's commitment to civic engagement, to suffrage generally. And so some of you probably are most of you are familiar with the women's organization of the church, the Relief Society. At this time, the Relief Society and the suffrage organizations here in Utah were intertwined. They were one and the same. This is the leaders of the Utah Women's Suffrage Association. Sarah Kimball is this older woman sitting right in the middle. She was actually the founder of the Relief Society back in Nauvoo, Illinois, many years prior to this. And she then founded the Utah Suffrage Association. So again, it's really important to recognize how intertwined these principles were. Well, of course, not everybody was happy about this, right? They thought that no matter what the Mormons said, plural marriage had to go. And there were other voices and other forces here in the Utah Territory at that time that weren't part of the LDS Church. In fact, Jenny Froiseth was an Irish immigrant who had come to Salt Lake with her husband and worked in journalism. And she started something called the Anti-Polygamy Standard. And this was a competing newspaper to the Woman's Exponent that argued for the barbarism of plural marriage and actively campaigned for Utah women, herself included, to have their right to vote removed until plural marriage was abolished. And so she was in a really interesting position of saying, you know what, I think it's great for all other American women to vote, but as long as plural marriage is being practiced in Utah, I don't want to vote, and I don't want any of these women around me to be able to vote either. So it was a really interesting and complicated dynamic. And so you have this from 1887 for about the next 10 years, you have this push and pull of these different groups here in Utah. All the while, the national suffrage leaders are looking at this, and they're really interested in what's going on. They're keeping an eye on it. And the pressures really come to a head in 1895. 1895 is when Utah finally gets the right to become a state. And there's a couple of key things that had to happen in order for Utah to finally become a state. First of all, they had to repeatedly ask Congress. They asked 7 times between 1847 and 1895 to become a state. But as I mentioned, the main hurdle to becoming a state was the continued practice of plural marriage. And as some of you may know, the church officially disavowed plural marriage in 1891. So the date of statehood is no coincidence. Finally, the church disavowed plural marriage, and the next application, the Congress finally said, okay, we'll consider that you can become a state. So what happens when a territory wants to become a state? There's a whole process. Basically, the state has to hold a constitutional convention, just like we learned about in Hamilton, this with the federal constitutional convention. That had to happen on each one of the state levels, where men got together and decided what they wanted the laws of the new state to be. They had to write a state constitution. So every state has its own constitution, as well as our American Constitution. And so the Constitutional Convention was made up of 107 men who met in May of 1895 to decide what the laws of the state of Utah were going to be. Well, Emmeline Wells and Sarah Kimball and all of those women had been working really hard for the past several years to make sure that when this day came and Utah got to become a state, that the women were going to be included in that constitution, that the enfranchisement of women, the right to vote for women, was going to be codified and written into the laws of the new state. And they were really confident about this. They're like, we know these guys, we know these 107 men, they're going to do the right thing by us women, and we trust that they're going to write in our suffrage rights into the state constitution. Well, it didn't go that smoothly. B.H. Roberts, so most of the men in the Constitutional Convention, I think over 100 of the 107 were members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they were leaders in the church as well. So we had a future prophet. B.H. Roberts was an apostle. Franklin S. Richards was an apostle. So very high-level members in the LDS Church were also part of this Constitutional Convention, writing the Utah State Constitution. And the church generally had been in favor of suffrage this entire time. For decades, they'd come out publicly supporting what Emmeline Wells and Sarah Kimball had been doing. Again, they had been letting the women use the Relief Society organization for all of their suffrage advocacy efforts. But at the Constitutional Convention, B.H. Roberts, this guy over here on the left, he kind of threw a wrench in the proceedings. And he said, you know what? It is more important to us that we secure statehood than we enfranchise our women. He's like, if we put women's suffrage into the Utah State Constitution and send it back east for approval, it's just still too radical. there were only 2 other states at that time that had enfranchised their women, Wyoming and Colorado. And both of them had done it for very strange reasons. Wyoming had done it for racist purposes. There were a number of Confederate soldiers that had come up to Wyoming, and they didn't like the fact that black men were now voting, but their white wives couldn't vote. So that was a little messy. And then Colorado, the battle there had been over the silver standard, which is like when you mark our currency against silver instead of gold, and women had been an important sort of special interest group in that conversation. So those two were kind of messy, and so B.H. Roberts said, you know what? We're going to be really the first state that comes in and says, we just want women to vote because it's the right thing to do. And he's like, that's just too risky. So he proposed separate submission. He said, I want to submit our state constitution to Congress first, and then once we're a state, then we can take care of the ladies. And Susan B. Anthony saw right through that. She wrote to Emmeline Wells, she wrote a telegram, and she said, do not let your constitution get passed without women being included, because you will get forgotten. It will no longer be a priority. And so battle ensued. And the men came down on either sides, and there's a great scene, and if you read the book, I hope you find this as amusing as I did. There's a wonderful scene where B.H. Roberts claims to bring a petition to the Constitutional Convention, showing all these names of Utahns who want separate submission. They want the state constitution submitted separately from suffrage. And another delegate reveals that he has forged a lot of the names on that petition, and that some of them were even children. So there's a great uproar in the Constitutional Convention. It's really fun. You can see it in the minutes of the meetings. We have it all documented. And at the end of the day, the Utah State Constitution includes Article 4, Section 1. So you can see who won the day. This article in our Utah State Constitution says the rights of citizens of the state of Utah to vote and hold office shall not be denied on account of sex. Both male and female citizens of this state shall enjoy equally all civil, political, and religious rights and privileges. And that's been in the Utah State Constitution since 1896, the third state to include any such sort of statement. This was big news, the fact that Utah came into the nation as a suffrage state. And so Susan B. Anthony, who is this lady right here in the middle with the severe hair, this is her here, Susan B. Anthony and Reverend Anna Howard Shaw, who were the two of the leaders of one of the main national suffrage groups, come to Utah to congratulate the women of Utah. And they hold a convention. And they say, okay, how can we replicate this success throughout other Western states? And that's where the book takes place, by the way. So if you read the book, that's where it starts. It starts at this convention where Susan B. Anthony comes to celebrate and congratulate the women of Utah. There are a couple other key women in this photo. This is Emmeline Wells right here. She was always a very eccentric and petite woman. She always, you can always identify her because she always prefers her profile, so she's always kind of standing in a certain way. This is Sarah Kimball, the very severe lady. She's quite elderly at this time. And this is Martha Hughes Cannon. You can see Martha Hughes Cannon is the next generation of Utah women's advocate. She's younger than those other two ladies, and she's going to have her moment now. With statehood came the opportunity to hold our own elections here in Utah, to have our own state legislature. So a state's legislature consists of a House of Representatives and a Senate, just the way Congress does in DC. And so right after statehood in 1896, we got to create our first Utah state legislature. We got to create a House of Representatives and a state Senate. And so that election was the first election open to women here in Utah. And Martha Hughes Cannon, that woman we just saw who's over here on the edge here, ran in that election. What's really fun about Martha Hughes Cannon is that she ran, the two-party system was brand new with statehood, so they'd never had Democrats or Republicans before, so they kind of just drew straws as to which party they were going to run under. They didn't really mean anything. And so Martha ran as a Democrat, and her husband, Angus Cannon, ran as a Republican. So she ran against her own husband in the race. Emmeline Wells actually ran as a Republican too. And Martha ended up beating both her mentor, Emmeline Wells, and her husband to become the first female state senator elected anywhere in the United States. These other two women were elected to the House of Representatives. They were not the first women to be elected to a House of Representatives, but the first here in Utah. But Martha was the first to be voted into a state senate anywhere in the United States. Just before I get to this slide, I'll just tell you a little bit about Martha's story and how it actually ends quite tragically. Martha Hughes Cannon was the fourth wife of Angus Cannon. And you may be saying, if you're following along with the dates, you're like, wait, but this is 1896. I thought plural marriage was ended in 1891. Why was she still a fourth wife? Well, you would be right that officially plural marriage had been made illegal and the church was officially no longer practicing it. But what happened in 1891 when it was ended? You had tens of thousands of people engaged in a system that was no longer legal, right? So in 1891, when these families were officially dissolved, the husband, had to choose just one wife to become his official legal wife. And this is a part of the story of plural marriage that is, almost universally overlooked. There was this sort of devastation that came with the end of plural marriage, where 60,000 women and children were declared illegitimate or bastardized because their families were dissolved legally. And if they were not chosen as the one wife to continue to legally be in the marriage with the man, they then kind of just were left on their own. And it was a terrible, terrible time in Utah history. Men were imprisoned, rounded up by federal marshals, put in prison for continuing to try to support their wives and children. And Angus Cannon was one of those men. He was repeatedly put in prison. He had to escape. He went to England for a while. And Martha, too, as the fourth wife, went into exile several times to try to avoid imprisonment. So in 1896, when she was voted into the state senate, she still considered herself married to Angus Cannon. And so what, of course, happened was she got pregnant. And so as a second-term senator, this apparently unmarried woman becomes pregnant, and considering it's 1896 in Utah, it makes the front page of the New York Times. And she unfortunately has to resign her position after several years in the state legislature and go into exile in California, where she has her baby, raises the baby. Unfortunately, the baby dies young, the daughter dies young, and she lives out the rest of her days in California. Martha was remarkable. Even aside from the story, she received 4 degrees by the age of 24, including a medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania, an elocution degree, a pharmacology, the medical degree is from Michigan. The pharmacology degree was from Pennsylvania. Anyway, brilliant doctor. She led the Deseret Hospital here. It was an all-female hospital. She started the first school for the deaf and the blind here. She introduced sanitation legislation for milk and water for new babies. Absolutely brilliant, important person in the history of our state and our country, who ended with a very tragic demise that really represented all of the complications of Utah's 19th century history. When the Utah women were done with getting their right to vote back themselves in their own state constitution, they turned their attention to the national conversation. So on the national front, there was still this massive effort to get a constitution added to the amendment that would enfranchise women generally. Rather than going state to state and working with state legislatures and working with the men in state legislatures to try to enfranchise their women state by state, the national leaders wanted an umbrella solution. They wanted an amendment. They wanted something that said every state has to open the right to vote to its women. And you can see here, this is Emmeline, always standing in profile. So she's here, very eccentric. And she's standing with delegates from the National Suffrage Association who have come from Washington, D.C. in a little car that they drove across the country with pages and pages of a petition in the back. And every little city they went to, they had women sign this petition. It's the longest petition that's ever been submitted to the U.S. government. It had millions and millions of names on it. And you can see the man that Emmeline's standing next to is Senator Reed Smoot. He was Utah's senator at the time. And so Utah got behind the suffrage amendment wholeheartedly. Here's Emmeline also standing on the steps of our Capitol building, leading the national suffrage delegation in 1915. Here we have same thing in 1916, the National Women's Party headquarters in Utah. And you have Utah women participating in one of the most famous episodes of the suffrage movement, which was the hunger strikes and the sit-ins at the White House. The suffrage movement changed a lot from the 19th century. In the 19th century, when our story began with the Utah women, there was really no mass media. There was no they had that indignation meeting that I told you about where 6,000 women came together, but there was no outlet for women to gather publicly, to voice their opinions, to write, to speak. And that changed at the beginning of the 20th century. The suffrage movement became much more militant. It became much more public. It became much more media friendly. And one of the things that the women started doing was hunger strikes. They started doing parades. All of these were new techniques. And one of the things that they did was chain themselves to the White House gate and starve themselves, do a hunger strike as they were chained to the White House gate. And in 1917, there were some Utah women that participated in what's known as the Night of Terror, when these women were rounded up and taken to prison for chaining themselves to the White House gate. Happily, the 19th Amendment was ratified in August 26, 1920. And I want to be very clear about what the amendment did. It basically removed the requirement of male gender from the voting laws. So it didn't proactively say all women can now vote anywhere. Basically what it did is it said you no longer have to be a man to vote. That's all the amendment did. Super cause for celebration. That's a really big deal. But there were whole groups of people, either because of their gender, but also because of their ethnicity, that were still left out of this major step. First of all, Native Americans were denied full citizenship, and you have to be a citizen to vote no matter whether you're a man or a woman. And unfortunately, Native Americans in Utah were one of the last groups to receive citizenship of any of the Native American groups in the nation. Asian immigrants were not considered citizens, therefore neither men nor women. And of course, you may be familiar with the Jim Crow laws that were put in place through most of the first half of the 20th century that intimidated black voters by imposing literacy tests that were impossible to pass, taxes that were impossible to pay. And so there, as I mentioned at the beginning, additional legislation was really needed to make sure that these particular groups also were counted as participants in our civic process. And so at Better Days 2020, we commissioned illustrations of 50 Utah women. We had all of our native Utah tribes represented. And we looked at the Japanese population, the Asian population, the Chinese migrant workers that worked on the railroad, the African American population, the Latinx population. It was a really fascinating experiment in looking at the way that our state has changed from the early days of Emmeline Wells and Sarah Kimball to being really a state that tries to look after all of its people and really is a much more representative group of what we are in the United States today. So as I mentioned, these questions continue. Who is a citizen? Who gets to vote? Why? What are the pressures and the motivations that cause people to want people to vote? What are the pressures and motivations that cause them not to want them to vote? And these conversations are alive and well today. So I hope there was something in that story that was new to you or that kind of surprised you or that gave you a different impression of yourself as a Utahn and maybe a different version of how you can move forward representing the rights of all Utahns going forward. So I would love to take some questions and talk to you more about the story. I have lots more to say about it. I know we have about 12 minutes, so how would you like to manage that? Oh, it does. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, we have 2 minutes.
If anybody has a quick question that they'd like to ask, yeah.
What motivated you to write your book?
To write Pioneering the Vote? Yeah, so as you can tell, it's a complicated story that is really, the only place that we really found any evidence of this story was in doctoral theses and in sort of, academic tomes that weren't really publicly or commercially available. And so I just wanted to tell the story in a really fun and narrative way that brought these characters to life and kind of showed, the surprising and loving elements of this story. Thanks. I'm happy to stick around for questions if people want to stay.